Today's topic is community and identity. I am your professor, Rachel Khan of the UP Journalism Department. Aristotle had said, "It is through our ability to communicate that we engage with the world around us." As we had said in previous classes, we use our senses to make sense of the world or to understand the world. We also make use of our senses to communicate with others and to learn from others, whether it's visual communication, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, or gustatory. Media tools, on the other hand, extend these senses so that we are able to reach more people. In today's class, we will answer, who am I? Or in other words, we will look at how communication helps shape our own identity. We ask the question, are we who we think we are, or are we whom others think we are? In the social sciences, identity is studied in two specific fields. In psychology, identity is the qualities, beliefs, personality, looks, and expressions that make a person. Weinrich had said, a person's identity is defined as the totality of one's self-construct, in which how one construes oneself in the present expresses the continuity between how one construes oneself in the past and how one construes oneself as one aspires to be in the future. In other words, one's self-image or self-construct depends on how we see ourselves from the past and how we have developed to the present and how we hope to be in the future. In sociology, identity is the portion of the individual's self-concept derived from perceived membership in a relevant social group. In communication, we look at specifically the communication theory of identity, which had been postulated by Michael Hecht, a professor at the Penn State University. For Michael Hecht, communication is identity. In other words, individuals do not have one identity, but multiple shifting identities. What does he mean? Basically, what he's saying is that while we are the same person, we are known or we could present ourselves differently depending on who we are dealing with and how we communicate. As we shall see in later on, the different layers of identity which make up this theory. Identity, he says, is constructed around the groups we are in as it is a social phenomenon. So it is not the psychology of concept of self, rather it is how we communicate self to others. Basically, Hecht is talking about 4 layers of identity. The theoretical construct or concept is like this. First, one's identity formation and management is as an ongoing process of communication with the self and with others. Second, individuals internalize social interactions, relationships, and a sense of self into identities through communication. In turn, identity is expressed or enacted through communication. In other words, one layer of identity or one way of developing who we are is based on our interactions with others, whether it is our family members, our peers, or different social groups. Third, the relationship between communication and identity is reciprocal. What does he mean? That basically the way we communicate is dependent on the identity or our view of self, and also vice versa. How we shape our identity is based on how others communicate with us and how we communicate with them. So that that um, exchange of communication, exchange of ideas, exchange of um, that interaction with others help shape our identity. And fourth, communication helps build, sustain, and modify one's identity. So as we engage more with others, we are able to enhance our own personalities, our own identities, and define ourselves within the society where we are in. So let's go through the layers. Let's start with the personal. This is self-concept or self-image. It is the locus or frame of the identity. So from here, self-image or self-identity is built first by who we think we are and also how we interact with others. It is analogous to one's self-cognitions, feelings about self, or even self-esteem, and also our spiritual sense of being. So, how individuals define themselves in general as well as in the particular. For example, in our mind, we say, I am smart. Because that is our self cognition, then we act that way in articulating our personal identity and in dealing with others. We see ourselves and we project ourselves as being smart, or as being sporty, or as being funny. It's an identity we build on depending on our own view of self. Then the second layer is the enacted. We have a certain view of ourselves. Is it the same way that we enact ourselves? One way to check is to see the image that you project on Facebook, the pictures that you choose to post. Is it reflective of the way you see yourself? Is that how you want others to see you? Or do you want others to see you differently? Are you projecting an image different from your own self-knowledge? This is very important. That in a way, this theory should help us come with a unity of identity, both in the self, project the personal identity and the enacted identity. Identity is seen as being enacted in communication through messages. This layer conceptualizes identity as a performance, as something being expressed. How do you communicate your identity to others? And in this sphere, we're not just talking about what we say and how we say it. We're also communicating through nonverbal cues. For example, the way we dress. What does it say about us? Our choice of color. Are we always in black? Are we projecting a goth self identity? Or is our jewelry gauche? Like just too much? Or none at all? Do we like the simple hairstyle, or do we like, a fancy cut? Or do we dye our hair orange or yellow or green? Does it project? The important thing is that it projects the same identity that we not just want to project, but who we really are, rather than it be diverse, or what we what we see ourselves in is not the enacted. The important thing is that they are uh, the same or almost the same, that it's the same person we're talking about. Otherwise, there might be um, problems that you need to face. And that's why it's very important to, using this theory, understand oneself. The third layer is that of relations. Relational identity is the identity seen as a mutual product jointly negotiated and mutually formed in relationships through communication. So as we said, this is the foundational theory is that of interpersonal. We have to see that many times our identity is also shaped by who we are. How we act, for example, as a sister or as a brother, as a son or a daughter, as a student or as a teacher. So the position we have in a relationship with another individual helps also define our identity. Of course, we could be more affectionate, for example, with family members than we are with friends, which is perfectly all right. In a way, it defines us depending on our milieu, depending on the relationship we have with the individual. I mean, you don't expect to treat a stranger the same way you would treat a sibling, right? So, of course, the sibling and the stranger will certainly not know you at the same level. And that is your identity as perhaps reflected in their eyes, where the sibling knows you better than, of course, a stranger wouldn't know you at all. So there are 3 sub-levels in this layer. The first, an individual constitutes his or her identity in terms of other people through social interaction with others. So as we get to know, for example, the stranger, and that stranger becomes a friend, then of course, even the layer of identity changes. The relationship changes. An individual creates his or her identity by identifying through or in light of relationships with others. This is true, especially if we want to be accepted by, we want to be that person's friend. Then, of course, we exert that effort to get to know that person and to help that person get to know us. And third, the relationship itself can be a unit of identity. This is especially true for couples, where we identify ourselves now as part of a pair. For example, married couple or partners. Then we identify ourselves not just by ourselves. And we find, at least I find that many married couples, for example, even choose to have a joint Facebook account. And that shows you maybe perhaps the closeness with which they identify themselves with the other. And the fourth, the communal layer, talks about group membership. Group members share common characteristics, histories, and collective memories that transcend individuals and result in commonly held identities. Sometimes these identities are manifested in stereotypes, but other times they are simply the cultural code for the group members, being, namely, how the individuals are socially constructed at the group level. For example, as journalists, especially those who are in a particular beat. I remember the time when I was in Malacanang Press Corps, we called ourselves the Brat Pack. Primarily because there were 2 sets or 2 types of journalists covering Malacanang. Those who were older, who were 40 and above, and we who were at the time in our early 20s. Um, we had barely got out of college, and we were pushed to the prime beat. And so the older ones actually were the ones who dubbed us the Brat Pack. So in a way, we had our own identity among ourselves. And then, of course, there's the stereotypes, what we call, for example, the Ilocano. I don't know if it's true, but if Ilocanos are really thrifty or even stringent in expenses, so these stereotypes that we have of certain ethnic groups is in a way an identity. It may or may not be true. Then, of course, how we socially construct ourselves in a group. For example, are you a member of army? If you don't understand what I just said, then, or if you think it has anything to do with the military, then you are not part of that group, which is the fan base of the BTS, Korean band. So they have in a way, a communal identity as being the BTS army. And many times there are socially constructed groups like this that exist in a certain time or a certain generation that does not transcend that generation. So these are the 4 levels or layers of identity discussed by Hecht. Apart from the 4 layers of identity discussed by Hecht, those who have critiqued his theory have suggested that it should be more expansive, especially in the level 4 or the communal layer of identity, to encompass other dimensions of identity. For example, the socio-cultural identity, which overlaps the personal, the relational, and the communal identity. For example, the identity that we have with our parents, our friends, our teachers, and the media help shape our identities. For example, you could say that I belong to this clan, and more or less the cousins have the same characteristics, the same way of talking, the same, you understand certain jokes that other people wouldn't understand, or because it's a private joke. So in a way, that defines your identity. Then, of course, there is the gender identity. Our gender identity is influenced by the way we are treated by our parents, other relatives, neighbors, and friends. In every culture, there are communications and interactions which are considered feminine, masculine, or androgynous. Nowadays, the media influences our identity in what is considered feminine, masculine, or androgynous. Sometimes media defines it erroneously or tries to put us in a box. So that does affect gender identities. Age identities also. Sometimes media shapes this and portrays it or puts us in a box. Because age is an aspect. For example, Generation X. Are you Gen X or are you Gen Y? Media has a way of categorizing and stereotyping these generations. The spiritual identity as well depends on the culture and context of our spiritual identity, which can be more or less apparent. Sometimes this is the side of us that we want to keep private. It's not something we readily share because it is more intimate in a sense than let's say our more external identities or our communal identities. Sometimes it is linked to culture. In some countries, people might even be ready to die for their beliefs, for example. People's spiritual identity may even lead to conflicts or, in worst cases, war. For example, you can imagine what identity of self a suicide bomber would have, right? in countries like Afghanistan or Liberia or Iran. So in a way, their culture affects their spiritual identity. Class identity is also something very strong in some cultures, um, sometimes more than others. Our social class identify or influences how we behave and communicate towards other people. Ideally, this should not be. And one of the things that's nice about UP is that it does not, um, it tries to destroy or tries to deconstruct class identity so that we are not boxed in. There is no rich or poor, but we are all equals um, in society, able to express ourselves freely. So a person's class identity is not necessarily noticed until he or she encounters another person representing another social class. Sometimes this is the class identity is something that we want to hide, especially in UP. If you want to blend, and you are from a very super rich family, I noticed that those who are from the super rich families, they try to hide this part of their identity simply so that they can blend in. It doesn't mean that they're faking it. It simply means that they are opening up their identities or their self-image to encompass more people, to be more accepted in their milieu. Then, of course, there's national identity, which I think is sorely lacking in terms of patriotism, for example, or love of country that we have in the Philippines. There are people who still put self above nation. So a person's citizenship in a nation is referred as national identity. Then, of course, there's the dimension of national identity where we see ourselves as a Filipino. For example, in terms of the communal identity, this is something where sometimes we only realize our Philippine identity when we are outside the Philippines. Because here, of course, we're all Filipino, so we don't notice this national identity. But for me, it became more apparent when I studied in the US to do my master's. And I felt the need to pursue or to push my national identity, to let people know I'm Filipino and to be proud of it. It's also a way to identify the other Filipinos. One thing I noticed is, how do you differentiate between a Filipino and Indonesian when you are crossing the street and there's a total stranger and he looks like you, but you're not sure, is he Filipino? One of the things I do is I let the person pass me, but like as they pass me with their backs turned, I go, psst. And if it's a Filipino, 100% of the time they turn their heads and say, Pinoy ka ba? And then, we get to talk and to meet. If they pass me as if they didn't hear anything, I am quite sure that they are either Indonesian or Thai, because we all look alike. Then there's the regional identity. In every country, there are regions, like we said, the Ilocanos, the Cebuanos, kung ikaw ay Bisayang Dako. All of this give us a certain identity or influences the way we are, or our own personal identity. What do we do with identities? As we said, it's apart from maybe understanding ourselves better, it also helps, for example, researching the role of the journalist in society. This is one of the recent studies on understanding professional identity and the role of journalists. So using this particular study does use the community of identity theory, and there are many other studies that do the same. that help us see or understand our role in society. And this is a changing role as, let's say, technology develops, as, let's say, even in a way, the identity of the journalist is influenced by the regime it is in. For example, the identity of a journalist during the martial law era was one of um, extreme courage, of also one who had to go underground to be able to do the work of a true journalist. Otherwise, one could be a journalist who has succumbed to the regime. In a very liberal society, a very democratic society, then perhaps the journalist has a different identity because one fits in, one doesn't have to hide anything, and one, perhaps the identity of a journalist in a liberal society is one who is more aggressive, right? Or one who realizes their greater responsibility because nobody is hindering them from reporting. So our environment does also influence even our professional identity. So I hope that discussion helps you understand this theory on the communication, or this theory of identity in communication, and to be able to use this for further research and to further, of course, first of all, understand our role in society.